Welcome back to the Mature Male Podcast. I'm your host, Wes, a psychotherapist helping men mature through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Dr. Fred Luskin, a world renowned expert on forgiveness and the director of the Stanford University Forgiveness Projects. Dr. Luskin holds a PhD in counseling and health psychology from Stanford University and is the author of several best-selling books, including Forgive for Good, Forgive for Love, and Stress Free for Good. His groundbreaking research demonstrates how forgiveness can significantly improve physical and emotional health, relationships, and overall satisfaction. He's conducted workshops and lectures for a diverse range of organizations globally, including Fortune 500 companies, healthcare systems, and educational institutions. We're thrilled to have him join us today and share his wisdom on the transformative power of forgiveness. Fred, welcome.
Thank you.
So your research at Stanford is focused on the psychological and physical benefits of forgiveness. Could you explain what forgiveness actually means from a scientific perspective and how it differs from what many people assume forgiveness means?
Well, as you know, a scientific perspective is simply kind of developing something you can measure. So it both has a lot in common with and is a little bit different. So most people think that forgiveness is like letting people off the hook or no longer blaming them or relinquishing their grudge. And that's true. That those are true. When you look at science, all you're saying is we're going to measure these very specific components and hope that they add up to something useful. So, you can measure, we've measured blood pressure. In healthy people, forgiveness doesn't change blood pressure. In people who have high blood pressure and are angry, when you add more forgiveness, it lowers blood pressure. So, what science can do is help break ideas down into smaller, measurable pieces. The good news for forgiveness folks, is that most ways that forgiveness is measured show modest positive benefit.
Yeah. Well, that is good news. And I appreciate how you've humbly reframed that while science can show us some things, it's not this all powerful absolute authority when speaking about forgiveness. And because it's not, and because it's more nuanced and we need steps to understand how to do it, you've developed something called the 9 Steps to Forgiveness method. Could you walk us through these steps and explain how men specifically might benefit from implementing this process in their lives?
It's not that we necessarily created the 9 steps for forgiveness. We tried to look at, in part, what happens when people forgive. Like, yes, it was partly testing a theory, which is also part of what science does. Like, a theory is you create a map of the world and then you test through experiment whether that theory holds true. And often they're just theories, they have no relevance to actual life. That's an unfortunate byproduct of science. Like, you find out that you believe that the earth is flat. But what theory does is it makes you become clearer about your assumptions, and then you check them out. Part of what we tried to do was look at also, well, people who have forgiven or go through the process, what do they do? How does it change? What becomes different? And that's part of the 9 steps. So it wasn't just testing a theory, it was also observing reality. So a couple of the steps that are really essential for teaching people about forgiveness. One of them is forgiveness occurs in the present more than it is about the past. Like, you're forgiving now. Like, this may have happened in the past, but it's between your ears now. It's not like the past is gone. So if you're going to forgive, if you're going to deal with it, you're dealing with it now so you can evaluate the pros and cons of forgiving now. That's one of the clear takeaways. Like, is it worth it being pissed off now about something that happened in 2008? Like, that's a very legitimate question, but it can only be answered now. The second reasonably simple idea is forgiveness is for you. It's not for anybody you think has harmed you. It's something you do for yourself. Like, it's not that people earn it or deserve it. They might, but you forgive to free yourself from the burden of your own resentment or self pity. And third, forgiveness has nothing to do with condoning bad behavior. Bad behavior exists all over the place. And when we are unforgiving, we take one tiny little piece of all the bad behavior in the world and we make it a big deal. So you can be stuck in traffic and somebody can cut you off and you can create a grudge against them that you can hold on to for a week. You remember that idiot who cut me off? When at the very moment that you're complaining about them, 10,000 people could be starving to death in the world and you could be leaving food over, but you don't care about that bad behavior. You just care about the guy who cut you off. So the condoning has nothing to do with it. What forgiveness is you are releasing negativity that you created. So you have to recognize that it is bad behavior, but you're choosing to not be stuck in how you see that bad behavior. You're moving on from your perspective. When that is conjoined with understanding that you can forgive something but not necessarily go back into relationship with it, you're much freer. So those three conditions frame so much of this. It's for you, it's done now, and you're not condoning or reconciling. You're releasing yourself.
What would you say of those 3 steps that, in your experience, you have found one to be harder or easier, or they each are varied in experience?
That's a good question. And having been interviewed like a million times, nobody has ever asked me that question. I'm going to say the hardest thing that we have found teaching is related to the condoning and reconciliation piece. That more people have no idea what forgiveness is and have terrible misconceptions about it. So many people will come into something and say, if I forgive them, I'm saying what they did is okay, and I can't do that. Or if I forgive them, I'm dishonoring the memory of somebody who was harmed. Or forgiveness and forgetting are the same thing. So we have to give people a much more accurate understanding of what it is before anything else can move forward.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's some really stereotypically common phrases you said in there that I grew up hearing, and I'm sure you did too. And it's so interesting with all the insight we have in AI and the internet. This still seems to be an issue that we can't correctly define nor understand something that is so widely applicable. Every single human at some point has been hurt or has hurt someone else, and forgiveness is a non-negotiable element of humanity. So I'm curious why you think we have where these narratives come from as far as how we understand forgiveness, and why we haven't further clarified and done more work to help people prioritize it. It's something I rarely hear. I always hear when someone's resentful or begrudging, or they were wronged, but I very rarely hear about forgiveness being a top virtue to exude.
I mean, human ignorance is remarkable. I mean, it's wide, it's deep, it's resistant to extinction. I mean, you got to give human ignorance credit for its passion and longevity and its power. It does appear that human beings really struggle with releasing negativity, and that they come up with all sorts of ways of talking to themselves why they shouldn't. Then there's culture, which often makes negativity a shared value of that culture. So then, if you give up that negativity, you're being disloyal to your culture. So you have individual stuff, you have cultural stuff, and you have family transmission. I mean, very few of us grow up in families that aren't a bit wacky. So when you have a wacky parent and another wacky parent, and now you have lots of wacky mixed families, every single one of us has a certain kind of formed nuttiness that, because it's based on our families of origin, we take as true. And so you're cutting through like human tendencies, familial tendencies, cultural tendencies, and then you add to that the brain's negativity bias, which brings in lots of anxiety and struggle. And finally, you just add how difficult life is and how much in a hurry people are. They don't have an opportunity to think that deeply. So there's a multiplicity of reasons why ignorance is profound and human beings don't change that much. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but there's a lot of truth in that answer.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the complexity of it. As much as we want to think that we're original or so detached, there is such a core imprint on who we are of conditioning that is really makes up the majority of our personality, our ideology, the way we see the world. And instead of rejecting that as this thing that doesn't make us who we are, what does it look like to accept it? But you said this earlier when it comes to forgiveness too, and it's something I try to touch on in my work is accepting is not enabling. Accepting is simply seeing reality as it is, coming to terms with that without partnering or condoning the intentions or consequences or repercussions of what you've done. And you talk about how much family, love the phrase wacky. I think everyone can get on board with that. How much family shapes things. Many men struggle with forgiveness in intimate relationships or family dynamics. I work with a lot of people who have a lot of unforgiveness, especially with a parent, and there's usually at least one man involved in that forgiveness family web. Could you describe how your approach to forgiveness can transform relationship patterns and help men develop deeper connections with their partners or children or parents?
I mean, if you look at forgiveness as primarily trait, not state. Trait means general, like overarching. State is something you do now, short term. So you can have a hostile temperament and be angry at the moment. I think the most important way to look at forgiveness is as trait, not state. So training people to like forgive one thing is useful, but not that useful. What you want to teach people is this idea of forgiveness is a good strategy for them for their life, and that it applies to all areas of their life. So it applies to forgiving themselves, it applies to forgiving their partner, it applies to forgiving their parents, it applies to forgiving the weather. If you go to Hawaii and the weather sucks, you can practice forgiveness around that. You want to see it as a trait concept, not a state concept. And that's the most important orientation to forgiveness because it allows you to start simple. So people come, we work with them, and they say, I had the world's worst parents, and maybe I can't forgive them. And we go, sure, that makes sense. Don't forgive them, but forgive your kid for making a mess. Forgive your partner for being late. Forgive your boss for not sounding perfect. Forgive the smaller daily life experiences that you're capable of doing so that you get in the habit and you become a hell of a lot nicer human being.
Yeah, that's very helpful because I think when many people think about forgiveness, understandably, they're triggered with overwhelm because what usually comes to mind is the ways they've been most hurt or wounded by someone. And instead of seeing it as this major abstract monster that you have to wrestle every day, I appreciate what you're saying is that it's a practice. It's actually a habit that you develop. And it seems like what you're saying is when you can learn to do it in the small ways, forgiving your boss or, when your kid messes up or interrupts, that develops a sense of normalcy to implement forgiveness, which then creates a deeper capacity for you to face the bigger things that you previously wouldn't have been ready to face. Is that what I'm hearing?
Who would teach somebody to play Beethoven when they're first starting the piano lessons? I mean, that just makes no sense. You teach them scales and where the keys are. Well, why would mental health concepts be any different?
That's a good point. And you often connect forgiveness with stress management and emotional well-being. And speaking of practical, how does holding on to those grievances affect men's physical and mental health? And speaking of practices, what have you found most effective for men to release those burdens in a habitual manner?
We did a research project decades ago and we advertised all over the place for forgiveness study looking for volunteers. And I don't know, we got 300 women and 25 men, or take. And then my research partner was doing his men's group in his church. And he asked them, like, hey, why are no guys showing up for this? We're giving away free stuff and it's good. And it's at Stanford. And the guy said to him, well, we don't show up for that squishy stuff called forgiveness. If you said got a grudge, you might get some more guys. Anybody pissed and got a grudge. So he went with that, and it turned out that we were about to be interviewed by the San Francisco Chronicle, the local paper, and he talked about it. Like women show up for forgiveness, men show up for a grudge. And after that article came out, lots of people called us because we now had broadened our catchment to got a grudge. And we were able to get like 50 more men, give or take, to participate in the project. So there is some caution with using words and ideas that may be more resonant for women than for men. And that's not a trivial thing. Secondly, we had better success with men by referring to the health benefits. So if you're pissed off at somebody, your heart rhythm gets all bent out of shape. And we'd show a wave, and then you have a nice little wave, and then you get pissed off, and the wave starts to shake. And if it shakes for too long, well, your heart's not doing so well. And what was interesting was when we could make a real link between like cardiovascular distress and stress and anger, like a good number of men were like, hey, okay, yeah, I get it. I don't need to have a heart attack for that asshole. And that was very helpful. And we saw in many situations that when men took to that cognitive reason of protecting their health, they opened to forgiveness often in a way that women did not when it came directly to their health. They were more invested in the emotional entanglement of what had happened. And we simply saw that as a gender difference. Okay. And we have to address multiple ways for people to hear it being in their best interest. There was no one portal of entry.
Yeah, it reminds me of an advertising, just the example of how Diet Coke was primarily drank by women, and so they created Coke Zero. and made the can black. And, it basically was catered based on the language and the theme and the visuals of what the masculine understands. So I see similar with the phrasing of holding a grudge. And you've mentioned several times this core emotion, anger, frustration. I'm curious how you relate anger to forgiveness. This feels like a very common correlation for men, that it's not as much, of course, it can be, of like jealousy or resentment, bitterness, all of those things are true. But if you ask most men, it seems like anger is at the forefront of either unforgiveness. So I'm curious if you could speak to that.
I would say the qualities that require forgiveness are anger and self pity. That a lot of unforgiveness is poor me. Like it's not fair. It shouldn't have happened. Why did this bad thing happen to me? It's not just anger. In terms of how is anger related to forgiveness, and like, is it more of an issue for men? I mean, you and I both know that emotional expression of vulnerability can be hard for men. So anger may be easier to access than fear or sadness or loneliness or the other parts of loss that go along often with being hurt. It can be easier sometimes to just refer to the anger. I'm going to say culturally, we have all been dumbed down emotionally, where so much of what people report about their emotional life now is I'm stressed, which is a dumbing down of nuance of all sorts of emotional experience to stressed. And that is the result of a overactive, over distracted, too busy world where a lot of the nuance of feeling becomes harder to access. I think the anger piece, that's some of it with men, that it's just harder to access the vulnerable parts. From my understanding, short term anger is a really helpful thing. It alerts us to what's wrong, identifies problems, tells us something needs our attention badly, and maybe even there's something in the world that needs to be taken care of or protected. Like, hey, kids being hurt, get angry, do something. There's nothing wrong with anger in the slightest. I mean, unless you use it to become aggressive or hostile. The problem is with longer term anger. When anger doesn't solve the problem and you don't give it up, then anger can become the problem. So if you're angry at the way your partner treats you and you don't say anything, or you just scream at your partner, then anger was wasted. If you're angry at your partner and you say, hey, we need to talk and you need to listen because I got stuff I need to share with you, but I'm not threatening you and there's no danger, but you need to hear me. Or if somebody's mistreating someone, anger is a wonderful guidepost. The problem is when anger doesn't work, when it doesn't solve the problem or doesn't help you, and you continue being angry, then you are harming your health by putting so much stress into your system, and you're continuing helplessness, because anger short time, it can be a sign of strength. Anger long term is a sign of weakness and failure, because the only reason you stay angry at something is because you haven't figured out how to make it better. And being angry long term is just a sign of that failure. I don't know how to handle this. I don't know what else to do, but I need to do something to make believe I'm doing something. And that's usually what long term anger is. And that is a quality that leads to some pretty serious health implications. And I think it's pretty bad for relationship, to have unresolved things that you maintain anger over rather than growing by recognizing that this anger is not effective in that situation.
That was probably one of the most succinct and accurate ways that I would agree that anger should be depicted. It's another misunderstood emotion, and unfortunately, it's one that men are demonized for expressing nowadays. And you touched on something really important, that it may be easier, just like seeing forgiveness as a day to day practice. It may be easier for a man to start with saying, what am I most angry about? And what are the triggers that make me the most angry? Starting there and then trying to correlate, is there anything unresolved, or using that phrase, is there a grudge here that I'm holding against someone else or even against myself? You said something at the end where if anger is held on to long term, you can have an internalized sense of failure because nothing gets complete or resolved or finalized or overcome. And I find many of us men carry a deep amount of shame and self criticism and loathing, that we have an anger towards ourselves almost, that we're not enough, that we're not doing enough, all these things. I'm wondering if you could speak to the more intrinsic, abstract concept of how to forgive yourself, seeing that, it's not involving another person per se, but it is in the sense of how you see yourself as another person almost. Could you walk us through how a guy would start to name the parts of himself he hasn't forgiven and how he can do that?
About anger and men, from what I understand, men are not necessarily more angry than women. I remember years ago reading that there were year by year studies done at the University of Michigan about, genders and their amount and expression of anger. They weren't different. They had different outcomes, and men were certainly more dangerous to women physically than women were to men. But it wasn't that they got more angry or they did more physical things. They were just more harmful. So while maybe a woman might, push the table, a man might push her. But the intensity and frequency were not very different. In terms of self forgiveness, the biggest misconception about that is that it's about feeling. And it's not really about feeling. What self forgiveness really is growing up. I wish I could say it more charitably, but I can't. If we screwed up, either gender, no matter where in the world you've done this, if you make a mistake or you have a bad trait that hurts someone, then like the clearest maturity is feel remorse. Like, no, it's not good to hurt people. It's not good to drink. It's not good to get fired. It's not good to not come home. It's not good to cheat. It's not good to lie. But we're human and we do all sorts of stupid things. But the key thing is remorse. I feel bad for what I have done, which is different than shame. Feeling bad for what you've done is really healthy. Shame usually is defined as feeling bad about yourself, which is different than feeling bad about what you did. And my belief is if we had more remorse, we'd have less shame. If we just honestly felt bad about some of our behaviors, but then with that remorse, you need to do sincere apology wherever you can. And that's hard for people. It requires humbling. I screwed up. I hurt you. I am sorry. Well, that's an essential for self forgiveness. You have to apologize. And as the 12-step programs make abundantly clear, not only do you have to apologize, but where you can, you make amends. You make it right. Like if you broke something, fix it. If you spent the family's money, earn it back. Like making amends, apologizing, feeling remorse. I'm going to say that's called growing up, maturity, cleaning up your mess. The self forgiveness piece is also changing. So if you have a bad habit or you regularly misbehave, shame means nothing. Feeling bad is a Epiphenomena means nothing. Changing means a lot. So if you hurt somebody, even if you hit someone, which is really horrible, you feel remorse, you apologize, you try to make it right, and you go to therapy. It's only then that you merit self forgiveness. It's not a feeling. It's, have I done in this world what I can to make right what I made wrong? And then you can let yourself off any hook. And if other people don't forgive you, that's on them. But until you've taken, and again, the 12-step programs have created a manual for this. But until you've done these steps, you're not worthy of self forgiveness.
You mentioned earlier this difference between traits and states, and it's the same with emotions. As much as we see the forgiveness as this new permanent reality that we are handcuffed to or stuck believing, in actuality, it was a temporary action during a temporary amount of time that created temporary or just emotions, which are temporary states, not traits. And it sounds like what you're saying is when we get into an unhelpful mindset, we concretize or absolutize forgiveness or unforgiveness as a trait. Oh, that's unforgivable. Oh, that person could never be forgiven. I could never forgive,
Exactly.
and I could never forgive myself, all these things. And it sounds like with your reframe, which I appreciate, is the conviction actually comes from the action. And if it's accurately applied to the action, then that helps you delineate and create space between you and the action because you feel bad about the action, not you. But if you don't feel bad enough about the action, you almost muddy the action and your identity. And then that's where the shame sets in. Well, I'm just a terrible person.
And who's going to trust you if you don't clean up your mess?
Right.
Like if you break something, grab a broom. But it's so simple. The other thing I will say about self forgiveness is the deeper problem with self forgiveness. It's practiced too much, not too little. The world is in a terrible state because people let themselves off too many hooks. More people ignore, minimize, deny their bad behavior than agonize over it. We make it too easy for us. Your partner says you're a slob. You go, no, I'm not. You're a neatnik. If we were really interested in honest self appraisal, we'd go to our partner and say, wow, you watch me every day. Talk to me. But we don't. We deny and defend. When we make mistakes, we tend to make excuses for ourselves. When somebody realistically confronts us at work, we rarely go, oh, thanks for bringing that to my attention. I need to look at it. There's a real problem with too much self forgiveness and not enough remorse and accountability. And that is one of the hidden little things in our world. The one other thing I'm going to say to you is a bit of a plug for the book that I just published. It's the Forgive for Good workbook. We just published that in March, and it contains an entire soup to nuts. How do you forgive? What is every step? Here are the prompts. It's an exhaustive, not exhaustive, but it goes through our process from beginning to end with prompts and exercises. But the reason I'm highlighting it is because we've expanded pretty dramatically the section on self forgiveness because it's such an important and difficult issue. And in that workbook, we say it's better to do good than feel bad. And that's the key message of self forgiveness. So if you're working with somebody, and I've done this for years, and they've really done some bad things that they can't forgive, ask them, what can you do now to make it right? Anything. Just what can you do now? I remember one woman who came to a series of classes and her kids wouldn't speak to her because she was an awful mother. And she was miserable now in her late 60s. And I reminded her, well, I don't know what you can do for your kids, but I know you can pay the world back by going and volunteering in your local elementary school to read to kids because you didn't do right by your own kids. Make it right. And so that behavior of do right rather than feel bad gives people something to do in the present that makes things more right, that beating themselves up on will never help.
Yeah, you said this earlier that forgiveness is not enablement, and I'm glad that you talk about responsibility and owning up to cleaning your side of the street, as they say in recovery, and how important that is. And I think that enablement acceptance structure plays out here in that, ironically, when we over forgive ourselves, it's truly enablement that we are passing as acceptance.
That's it.
And we get caught in that misunderstanding of it, then that constructs the narrative, which then alleviates you of any responsibility. Because if you're fully enabled to do it to begin with, hell, why should I change? What do I need to change? What do I need to own up to? There's none of that. And it's as painful as it is, of course, and can be humiliating to see things as they are and the actions, the consequences of those actions. That's the only way forward. So I appreciate you mentioning that. And I'm curious, if someone is in the process of trying to truly understand how to forgive, and maybe your book touches on this, we'll put that in the show notes. What are some signs to help people understand if they may be truly ready to forgive? So maybe what you do until you're ready to forgive, when you may know you're at a place where it feels right, true, and best to forgive, and then from there, how to actually do that.
It may never feel right, true, and ready to forgive, but it may start feeling stupider and stupider to continue to not forgive. And more people throw up their hands because they finally get tired of hitting their head against the wall. So if for 28 years after being a child, you still hate mom and mom's dead, then one day you may wake up and say, boy, this was a stupid waste of time. It's not that mom deserves great kudos for being a bad mom, but my strategy of ruining my life because I had a bad mom, that ain't working so well. And so that Dr. Phil question from a generation ago, how's that working for you? That is probably the most critical question that somebody could ask themselves as to whether they're ready to forgive, which is okay, if I'm honest with what I'm doing. So you talk about recovery, and our workbook is oriented topically towards people in recovery, but it's a generic workbook. That how's it working for me? I've been, over drinking now for 15 years. I did have terrible parents, but how's this alcohol working for me? Or how's this avoiding intimate connection working for me? Or how's being an abusive bully working for me? That's the critical question. How are my actions working for me? That's the moment of choice. Not do they deserve it, not anything, but how's it working for me? And we find and have found that many, many, many people after a while get sick and tired of their way of being. I'm just sick of this. I'm sick of waking up and hating people, or I'm sick of not waking up and putting the covers over my head. Um, the second piece is we look at forgiveness as the resolution of grief. And so you don't go immediately into forgiveness. You suffer for a while. That is healthy, necessary, and essential part of being a human being is you suffer for a while when you've been badly treated, wounded, or you lost something. That is a part of humanity. It's a necessary part of humanity, and you can't short circuit that. So if somebody's partner cheats on them, be pissed for a few months. That's fine. But don't be pissed for a few years, and don't blame the next three partners for the partner back then that cheated on you. that's when you're shooting yourself in the foot, so to speak. But if you understand that forgiveness is the resolution of grief, and grief requires like a number of emotions, and you've only been pissed, then before you're ready to forgive, you probably need to remind yourself to touch some of the sadness and vulnerability, because then you've explored your hurt more fully. So if you're furious at the ex, that's fine for 3 months or 6 months if you have to be. But before you're fully, really willing to let it go, you need to touch the fact of, wow, trusting somebody's scary. And if I trust again, it may hurt again. And that's part of the reason I'm so angry, is I'm so afraid to trust again. And the anger was a defense. So grief is going through this process of allowing oneself to be scared, angry, a little shut down, sad, and then grief has served its purpose and it becomes perseverative. And you're no longer getting anything from it. You're not growing, you're not learning, you're not moving ahead. And that's when forgiveness needs to come into the picture.
I've never heard anyone mention grief tied with forgiveness. I appreciate that really paramount way to understand forgiveness. And it sounds like what you're saying is the grief is the acknowledgement of what's been lost, the actual loss in the wrong that has happened or the hurt or the wounding. And that word forgiveness, forgive, you are giving yourself something that has been taken or lost. And those have to intrinsically be related because of that. And that's something to really think about. And you mentioned the example of a partner cheating. I'm curious, while forgiveness is subjective to every individual and dynamic involved, have you found throughout your years of research and experience that there are certain common scenarios or actions that are harder to forgive or easier, or is it completely subjective to the individual?
Most common thing that brings people to forgiveness is crappy exes. I mean, that's beyond that's more than anything else together. And crappy X's come in so many different flavors of crappy. But crappy X's are number one. Number two is probably parents, crappy parents, bad childhoods, because those are the universal things. Those are the biggest ways that people are hurt, either in their child origin, family of origin, or in their intimate encounters. Everything else kind of swirls around secondary to those. And they have some linkages, obviously. If you were not loved as a child in a way that was good to you, you're going to have a harder time with adult intimacy. And if you had terrible models of parents, you're going to have a hard time choosing a partner who might be a worthy partner. I mean, it's where does this stuff come from? It's some of it's generated in our youthful experiences. But the ongoing damage that crappy exes do to each other as they fight over custody, or don't pay child support, or don't return the kid on time, or do all sorts of things. That's the deepest torment that I have seen, is continuing to negotiate with an ongoing crappy ex.
Yeah, because that wound is still active and open, and there's no sense of resolve in two ways. One, that person not only is actively creating the hurt, but two, they continually have the lack of capacity to move beyond the hurt and to stop that action, and you're stuck in that dynamic. So I appreciate you naming that. I think it's important to know scenarios because we're bound to life's limits, right? I mean, we can only do so much, and relationships means that we are intimately connected, for better and for worse. And I think it's a really good point and something we can leave people with as far as where to most look from forgiveness is where are your most intimate relationships, and whether or not those people are positive in your mind, nonetheless, let's say it's a parent, they play a role that no one else can. You only have one partner. You only have that one type of parent. You only have that one sibling, et cetera. So I think it brings up a good point that while we wish it was different, the forgiveness is bound to the uniqueness and intimacy of that relationship in which it was first needed. So I appreciate all the
Well,
guidance.
and also, it's harder to defend against feelings and relationships that go deep. You know, you can meet somebody in the street and they can disrespect you, and some people get really pissed at that. But it's much harder to come home and have someone disrespect you.
That's a good point. I'm curious if you could leave people with one practice or principle around forgiveness, what would that be?
Be very careful after normal grief of telling a story about what happened to you that keeps you stuck. So if you give yourself for a really bad breakup, if you give yourself a year to say anything you want about that asshole ex, if you give yourself a year to do that, at some point you simply say to yourself, no more. At the end of that year or whatever period of time, I'm not going to attack him with my words. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for a story that I can tell myself and other people that sets us free. So it could be I made a terrible decision and I suffered for it, or I had no idea how awful they could be, and they were way worse than I'd ever imagined, and it's taken me years to get through it, but now it's my life. But you have to come up with a story that's true enough that you can move ahead with, that story doesn't put a ball and chain around you and keep you back in the past. And that is the freedom that each of us has to create a story that doesn't make our life more difficult. And that's probably the biggest thing that I've learned about forgiveness, is that forgiveness is mostly a change in story. So that's decades later finally understanding it enough to be simple.
Yeah, wow, that's profound and is something that reminds me of how we are storytelling beings, that we are driven by narrative, by symbolism, by meaning. So as we wrap up, where can people find you and what you're up to?
I mean, I have a website, fredluskin.com. If you just Google me, there's like, 100 videos of me doing whatever I do. And the three books that I've written on forgiveness would take anybody through how to do it, the ups and downs of it. I mean, we've charted that territory.
Okay, and we'll make sure to highlight that new book that you got and make sure if people have any questions about forgiveness, especially wanting a practical guide, then this is the go to. Thank you again for your time. And men is the takeaway. Choose forgiveness, choose to change the narrative about yourself, about the other person involved. Make it a habit, make it something that you see as necessary to be the person, the mature male you were made to be.